Welcome back to Innovating Leadership, Co-Creating Our Future. I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf, CEO of the Innovative Leadership Institute, where we help leaders be future ready. Today, we're diving into a powerful exploration of leadership, authority, and the courage it takes to resist abuse from within the system. Our guest is Ira Chaleff, whose work has long pushed the boundaries of what it means to be a responsible follower. His book and newly released audiobook, To Stop a Tyrant, The Power of Political Followers, offers timely insight on standing up to abuse of power. Ira, it's been a few months since we spoke, and the world's undergone significant changes even in these few months.
First, Maureen, I love the introduction. You really framed this well. So thank you very much for having me back again. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you because we're both very curious about the world and how we might make it better.
We are seeing more authoritarian or certainly more assertive leadership behavior in the business sector. People who previously were more inclusive, more collaborative, are shifting their behaviors, and employees and followers are struggling with what is the appropriate way to respond to this situation.
We are, in a sense, looking at a variation of the fundamentals of leader-follower dynamics. Essentially, when we're in a follower role, one of our responsibilities is to understand what is the leader trying to achieve that is aligned with the purpose of the organization, and how can we best support them to achieving that. That's the fundamental role.
Mhm.
At the same time, because all leaders are humans and therefore they all have flaws, as we all do, they will have blind spots, they will make misjudgments, they will get overly cocky, and they really require that the people around them be truthful and say, boss, that's a bridge too far. They may or may not be well received. That's okay. There's no requirement that the leader absolutely listen to all of the feedback. And yet, at the same time, followers have a responsibility that if they see that the actions that the leader is taking are very likely going to be detrimental, they have to figure out other ways to present their case and get the leader to see the danger there. And often the way you do that is to align your feedback with what the leader perceives is their self-interest. And we will all have self-interest. So you have to always take into account the mission, the culture, and the perceived self-interest. And then with ethical acuity, work out the best way to make your case. Followership is not easy. It's a real art.
I appreciate that you're saying that because I'm thinking of lots of situations where if we have a leader who isn't receptive, the person who pays the price for expressing their concern is the follower. The leader gets to keep their job. The follower gets invited to become an alumni in some cases.
I agree that you want to keep your job. Possibly even more important, you want to keep your reputation so that if you do need to part ways in this company, you still have your reputation in the industry. You also probably want to keep your legal liability to a minimum. So there are always a number of different factors to consider when responding to a problematic situation. Both in my earlier books on the courageous follower and intelligent disobedience, as well as in my current book, To Stop a Tyrant, I offer ways to think about these and to make choices that are not reflexive, but they're really well thought out. There's always risk, there's no guarantee of outcome, but keeping your own integrity and making sure that the path that you choose to walk is the path that you're not going to regret 10 or 20 years from now.
Which I really appreciate.
Let's take this because, my books all weave together. I started writing about followership about 4 decades ago because I was very concerned historically about the misuse of power, particularly in governments, but also in corporations. We all know the stories of malfeasance, and they're very disturbing, and a lot of people get hurt. The leadership industry has done a good job of naming all of the virtues of good leadership and trying to get people in leadership classes to understand those virtues and activate them. It's done a terrible job of shining the light on the dark side of leadership. The side of leadership that's based on ego and greed and trauma and power and control. All of these show up at different times in corporations, in governments, in the military, rather than just become the effect of that. Certainly, as we rise within our organization, we have to have the political astuteness to understand how can we use our position, our voice, our acquired power to make a difference in that. Not to remove the leader necessarily, but to get their better angels to again be ascendant and their darker sides to kind of crawl back into the cave from which they came. And that's hard to do, as you've said, but it's doable. In my new book, I devote a lot of chapters to what I call political acuity, political savvy, because it's not simply enough to be right and morally indignant. You have to understand the politics of the people of the group you're in and learn how to productively navigate those politics so you can make a difference. So even though this current book is focused very, very roundly on political leadership, it translates very easily to corporate leadership and followership as well.
That's important because I assume many of our listeners are working in corporations, small businesses, nonprofits.
Here's the good news. We are still in a democracy. Again, my book is called To Stop a Tyrant. It doesn't mean that the president is a tyrant. It means that the president has certain characteristics, which I call proto-tyrant, that could become tyrannical if not appropriately checked. And I go into these definitionally in the book. I didn't write the book because of the current president. I wrote the book because this is endemic to government leadership throughout history. What we need to be able to do is to understand what are the ways that we can create a relationship wherever we are in society. So, for example, in the business world, as soon as the first exceedingly high tariffs were announced, I knew for a fact, not because I have inside information, but just because I understand systems, that the system was going to react. Farmers were going to say, well, wait a second, look what you're doing here. This could really ruin us. Oh, by the way, the farm states are really critical to your reelection, to the reelection of your party holding a majority. I think that's even happening with immigration. In the United States right now, we're experiencing, I think everyone would agree, pretty draconian responses to our legitimate immigration problem, but the responses are being particularly draconian. We are starting to see the system react. Well, wait a second. I was just reading about the devastating fires in California where there's so much toxic cleanup. Who's doing the toxic cleanup? It's, hundreds of immigrant workers are out there cleaning that up. Suddenly, they're afraid to come to work. Well, wait a second. Who are the people who are quite moneyed, who own those properties, who say, well, wait a second, we've got to get them back to work? The same in the meat processing plants, in the poultry processing plants, etc. The system will be elastic and it will tend to give pretty forceful feedback to the political authority. Now, what we need to do is to make sure that the political authority remains responsive to that. In our case, the current president was elected to achieve certain things and has the right to try their way of achieving those things. This is why I'm very clear in my book that my book is nonpartisan. I'm not saying that the Democratic way is the right way to deal with it or the Republican way. What I'm saying is that as a country, there are issues that must be dealt with, and they must be dealt with sufficient intensity and power to actually make a difference, but not so much as to erode our democratic institutions. And that's the line that we have to learn to walk here at this time in our history.
Ira, what would that look like to you? We have had other times in history when we've had authoritarian leaders. And as we look around the globe, there are also other societies who have had authoritarian leaders. They were able to come out of those times with parts of their system strengthened so as to reduce the probability that that happens again in the near future.
I love the fact that you're stepping back and taking an historical perspective. What I find is that some of my friends on the progressive side are just, they're melting down. They think the world is coming to an end. Some of my friends on the, I don't even know I could call it the conservative side, but conservative slash MAGA side, they melt down saying the deep state is ruining our country. We're going to cease to exist. None of that is true. Neither of that is true. We have to understand that because of the amplifier effect of the media, that making sort of outrageous claims on both sides feeds the anxiety of both sides. And we wind up with a country that is too anxious to think and act rationally. That's bad. In my book, what I'm doing is stepping back and saying, look, this has occurred throughout history. It always feels like this is the worst time. There's a trick here, not to underestimate and become complacent, but not to get so anxious that you actually lose the capacity to think strategically and take strategic action. What's different about my book is that I'm not looking at what's wrong with the leader so much. I'm looking at how do we as followers, regardless of where we are in the political system, how do we tend to respond? In which way are those not functional? How could we do that better? And how could we make a positive difference and feel that we can make a positive difference, regardless where we are in the political system?
Ira, let's dive into a few of those. You said earlier aligning the organization's interest with the better angels of the leader. So you are running an organization and this is our mission, and that thing you did amplified and this other thing undermined our mission. Can you give a couple examples of that or additional recommendations to put into practice?
In current leadership theory, we don't talk about leaders. We talk about a relationship between leaders, followers, and context. Context is very important. The context of a military unit during war is different than the context of a military unit during peace. The context of a corporate situation during expansion is different than during a contraction of the industry or the company. So the strategies that you use have to be within the context of what is happening. The leaders are going to be under great stress, whether they're managing a contraction or an expansion. There's a lot of stress. How do we help them from wherever we are in the organization? We may be 5 levels below the CEO, but we certainly can help our direct manager and their manager. And you can get a cascading upward effect of helping people both through support to manage the stresses and then through truth telling to put the right issues that need examining on the table at the higher levels of the organization where they can be reviewed and dealt with. Again, in my books, I give so much information on how we can each do it. I'm an executive coach. If I was coaching you, I would be coaching you differently than I would coach someone else because your context would be different. Your position would be different. Your own risk factors would be different. So I would have to be cognizant of all of that and then ask you to view your options within those realities. In my books, I try to do that a little bit more globally in terms of if you're in the middle of the organization, here's what it'll tend to look like. Here's what your options will tend to be. If you're at the senior levels, you're going to have different stresses, different expectations, requirements. And even though it seems like you have more power the higher up you go, that isn't always the case. Sometimes you're more restricted because you're expected to be loyal no matter what. The same happens in the political system. So in my book, I look at To Stop a Tyrant. I look at the 5 different levels of citizenship or followership within a governmental system. And on each one, I describe what are the potential pitfalls, powers, and communication channels, strategies. It's up to the reader to then identify, well, yeah, that's me here. Let me think about what I could do differently or more of or less of now that I have a new lens on which to look at that.
So, as I'm reading To Stop a Tyrant, I might read through the lens of I'm a citizen in the country. And if I'm in South Korea, I'm going to be a citizen in a different country. I can still use this durable framework, but it may look slightly different for me.
Absolutely. It is going to look different culturally. It always does. But I use quite a few global examples in To Stop a Tyrant because there are so many examples, unfortunately. And in some ways, there are more examples globally than there are historically in our country. That doesn't make us immune from the potential here, as our founding fathers well knew. That was the whole design of the system they created because they understood that, we were trying to free ourselves from a royal system and we were experimenting with this whole new way of doing things. But we were still people, and people have certain character dispositions, and we could be again wooed back to some sort of a authoritarian or even royal model. This is an age-old challenge. What I've done in this book is based on my 40 years of experience in Washington, D.C., and working globally with countries like Nigeria or Sierra Leone or with Asian countries. I have put this into a framework that I think speaks to pretty much anyone. And again, I've been pristine in not castigating anyone for their political beliefs, but rather getting them to examine the dynamics through which they form their political beliefs and act their political beliefs, and how they might want to do that differently so that they really get the results out of their leaders that they want, not the results that they didn't want, which happens too often in history.
One of the things you mentioned that seems paramount here is understanding how the system operates. So I may be a single issue voter, which puts me at risk of making a decision that my elected official may vote like I want on women's rights, but may then also vote against my values on several other rights.
Yeah, the truth, as I see it, Maureen, is that the systems we're part of are so complex that actually none of us can fully understand them. I am continuously amazed and somewhat chastened as I learn more and more about how our systems in this country work. So I think it's probably more than we can really realistically ask each of us to fully understand the systems. What I think we need to do and can do is go back to the basics. If you have an issue that you are strongly for or against, by all means, use the legitimate levers at your control to speak up for or against that issue. At the same time, though, all of us need to understand that the fact that you can speak up for your issue is because we are in a democratic, highly complex system in which these basic rights of speech and assembly and media, etc., have been guaranteed. And we have to understand that if those seem threatened, then what's even more important than our issue is the system's integrity itself. And that's where I'm at the moment in our political moment here. I believe that, again, politics is always about people, very energetically fighting for the way they think the country should be and what we should be doing, what we should not be doing. That's normal politics. What we're seeing, and I'm concerned about, because this is the nexus of my book, is that if you consolidate too much power in one person, in one office, then you move down the historical route of how republics and democracies become tyrannies from Greece and Rome onward. Again, our founders understood that, and that's why they went to great pains to separate the powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judicial, and implicitly through the press, the universities, the church, etc. I think that that's where we have to keep our eye on the ball at the moment, and to make sure that we're standing up for those institutions in whatever way we can do so. And again, in my book, you will identify where you are in the system and what you could potentially do to stand up for the system.
You referenced the 5 circles. I assume it's those 5 circles that help guide your readers to what is an appropriate and advisable action.
Models are just helpful to, again, hold very complex realities in a way that we can remember them. So these 5 circles, there are no real circles, are there? But what they are is, what is your relative proximity to the leader? By that, I mean your relative capacity to actually reach the leader directly or indirectly. So the outer circle is the populace. We have a potential to influence through rallies that we go to or don't go to, and through the voting, of course. The next circle are activists, and these are those of us who feel so strongly that we put a lot of the rest of our life on hold, and we work for or against issues or particular political figures. And there are traps here, and there are powers there that need to be understood, and I'll go into that. The third circle are the bureaucrats. Now, bureaucrats have a bad name in our system, but there is no government without bureaucracy. Bureaucracy has to exist for government policies to be implemented. There can be too much bureaucracy. It can get too complex. It can get to the point where it starts to actually make it more difficult to get things done. Sometimes bureaucracy has to be cut down to size. There are all those realities, but you have to have a bureaucracy. And in my experience, I have worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals who work for the federal government who are so smart, so educated, so dedicated. And yet, how do they navigate what they consider very perilous times? I go into that in significant depth. The fourth circle are what we call elites. And elites are not just people with a lot of money. Elites are anybody who can command the attention of the broader population and of the political leadership. Entertainers are elites, sports figures are elites. Not every member of Congress is an elite, but some really are elite. The people who control the internet are elites, and etc. There are serious mistakes that elites can make and have made throughout history. And I go into those in the book and really warn those who are, in fact, elites, pay attention, because you could inadvertently wind up creating something you did not intend to create. And lastly, there's the inner circle, the people that the leader relies on the most, must rely on. And there's something to be said that the character of the people who most closely surround a leader tell you a lot about the leader. Just because you don't like the characters, that doesn't mean that they can't effectively be a check on the leader's proclivities, but they could also be an enabler. They can suffer serious long-term consequences. We look at Watergate, the number of people who went to jail because they enabled Nixon's cover-up. In each of the chapters of the book, I am looking at, where are you? What are the danger points? What are the potential power points? And how can you do something so you have agency and you can make a positive difference and avoid the pitfalls?
And I can't resist but say the dynamics between Trump and Musk is an interesting one.
Extremely interesting and not unpredictable. And I'm not going to just single out Musk and Trump. All people who rise to the very, very top of their field have huge egos. It's extremely rare to have a true servant leader. They exist, they're very valuable, but it's rare. And ego dynamics probably are an important part of a leader's ability to generate the energy needed to be a leader. But those clash. And and they've clashed again throughout history. How many wars in Europe were because this king insulted that king's wife or the duke's daughter or whatever, and the consequences are terrible. So what we saw play out with Musk and Trump, and it's not fully played out yet, is an example. I hope that other elites will read at least the chapters of my book that help them navigate those dynamics.
I want to shift now from national politics to corporate politics. While they may have slightly different titles for the circles, there is the rank and file instead of the population, but the five circles probably hold relatively true.
Yes, there is an analogy there. What I do in the book, which would be most relevant to corporate life, is I look at the unspoken rules of hierarchy. For example, it's almost a rule that almost no one will break to go above their boss's head. And as I lay out in the book, sometimes the worst thing you can do is not go above your boss's head. But how you do that in a way that does your best to preserve the relationship can actually help make your career instead of break your career. So there are shibboleths that need examining in the corporate world as well. I think I do a pretty strong job of that, particularly in the circle on bureaucrats, because all large corporations are to some degree bureaucracies, you see. And therefore, I think people will see quite clearly where they would fit in the organizational structure. Small businesses are different. In a sense, in a small business, you're more likely to be part of the inner circle, even. And so, how you comport yourself there, I think those chapters would be most relevant to you.
And one thing I want to point out, and hopefully listeners are hearing this through the conversation, this is absolutely a nonpartisan evaluation of stopping a tyrant. Like you said, the book was already written when the current election in the US had happened. You wrote it based on a much larger arc of history.
Yes, I've been writing this book almost since childhood. As I've shared with you in the past, my maternal grandmother lost her family in the Holocaust. And I've always been compelled to ask, how is it that leaders can rise and be so destructive? And what can we do differently? And the answer turned out that the way we follow needs to be different. And there are many different ways of following, some quite healthy and some quite unhealthy. Again, in the book, we look at what does it mean to be a conformist follower. Yeah, you might sort of save your own skin, but you wind up, in a sense, allowing the whole organization to go down the wrong path. Or you could be a colluder follower who thinks, wow, this is an opportunity for me to get ahead. And you could wind up supporting unethical behavior. Or you could be a courageous follower who says, this isn't in the interest of the corporation or the people we serve, or ultimately even the leaders of the organization. And I'm going to find politically savvy ways to speak up and try to change this trajectory. We all know the huge ethical examples of this with banks that have written millions of accounts that a clients didn't ask to be opened, or automobile companies that have jiggered the exhaust mechanisms so that they pass the tests but have 40 times more the exhaust than is allowed by law. And this goes on and on. This is not a pretty picture. It's a shame because almost everybody who works in organization and government is trying to do the right thing. But sometimes the system's incentives are set up to encourage the wrong thing. There are wrong incentives in politics, there are wrong incentives in the corporate world. Behavior starts to change in ways that can be quite injurious. So The principles of courageous following, how do you do it? I think are essential for all of us, no matter where we work, if we work in a school lunchroom or a factory floor or a high-tech industry. We all have to deal with the pressures that come from, oh, we're supposed to make this metric, we're supposed to make that metric, we can't fail on this one. Well, it's okay if you cut a corner. As we're recording this, we've just experienced a disaster of over 100 lives lost in the floods in Texas. And, the fact that the girls' camp where 27 young girls' lives were lost, the cabin in which they slept, it was known to be in a floodplain. And because people didn't speak up strenuously enough, it was allowed to go on and on until the disaster. And so many people's lives will be tragically affected for the rest of their lives. So this applies to all of us, wherever we are. I hope that I make a contribution to each of your listeners' lives on how to avoid those pitfalls and do the best they can within their contexts.
Ira, thank you for ending with such a strong case. How would listeners get a hold of your hard copy book or your Audible book?
Well, Audible will be on Audible, and it's To Stop a Tyrant, The Power of Political Followers. Hard copies of the book are available through whatever booksellers you choose to use. And my website will give you more information, and that's my name, which I assume you'll write up somewhere, irachaleffauthor.com.
Thank you, Ira, and thank you to our listeners for engaging ethically and courageously during a time that is interesting in the arc of history.
Yes. Thank you so much, Maureen.
Thank you. And for our listeners, please like us, share us, make comments. Your engagement helps us sustain this show.